Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Ellen Oxfeld is professor of anthropology at Middlebury College and also a legendary member of the Middlebury faculty. I say that because what I like best about Ellen is that she is never afraid to speak truth to power, and you always know exactly where she stands. And I think those are incredibly valuable qualities in any community of learning. In addition to her distinguished teaching, Ellen has made major scholarly contributions. She is the author of Blood, Sweat, and Mahjong, Family and Enterprise in an Overseas Chinese Community. And this book won the 1996 Thomas Zenietsky Award from the American Sociological Association section on international migration. She's also co-editor with Linnell and Long of Coming Home, Immigrants, Refugees, and Those Who Stayed Behind. She has a forthcoming book that's tentatively titled Moonshadow Pond, Memory and Morality in a Chinese Village, that I believe is based at least in part on research she conducted last year and 10 years ago while on leave in China. Ellen was educated at, we'll forgive her for this, she was educated at Williams College and also Harvard University, where she received both a PhD in social anthropology, but also a master's in the famous or infamous regional studies program at Harvard, and hers was in East Asian studies. We have the same degree, I realized, except mine's in Soviet Union, a degree in something that no longer exists. Very useful. Her talk today is entitled, as you can see, The Culture of Food in Rural China. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ellen Oxfeld to the colloquium.
Well, thanks, Allison, and sorry it's not Chinese food, but it wouldn't have been the food you would get in rural China, so it's probably just as well. I wanted to start just with a little note about my title and then a short anecdote. First, the culture of food. And just anthropologically speaking, we say that there are two things that make we humans different from other primates. And it's not our ability to make war, because we now know that chimpanzees fight over territory, so that doesn't make us unique. We do say that we're unique because we have culture, that is, we ascribe meaning to things. But the other thing that makes us unique amongst primates is that we cook. And this is a uniquely human invention. And the reason we cook has to do with our skeletal structure and that we need to process food before we eat it. But what this means is that cooking, as the great anthropologist Levi-Strauss has reminded us, has always been a symbol for culture. And you'll find in all kinds of mythologies that the transformation of raw nature to culture is often symbolically, the symbol of cooking is usually used for that transformation. So for we humans, eating is more than just, animal feed. We need to eat in order to survive, but it's something that we ascribe meaning to. Now, on that note, just a short anecdote, I was thinking a little before the talk about the meanings that we humans, or we Americans in this case, have given to Chinese food over the last few decades. And that's kind of interesting. Sort of in the mid-20th century, before the communists came to power, and even after they came to power during the collective era, when we thought of food in China, we usually thought of the land of hunger, the land of famine, the land of food shortage. Parallel to that, we often think now, and in the past too, of a great culinary tradition, which there certainly is a fabulous culinary tradition. That's kind of high cultural culinary tradition. Recently, however, I would say the last 5 years when we think of China, we often think of things like poison, food that's been played around with. I was thinking about an article that was in the New York Times earlier this month about the U.S. Olympic team, where the cook the chief cook for the Olympic team, went to a marketplace in Beijing and claimed, I don't know if this is true or not, but claimed she saw a 14-inch half of a chicken breast. And I don't know if even in the United States if I've ever seen a 14-inch chicken breast. So anyway, she had it tested, and it was full of steroids and all kinds of stuff that's not good for you. So she decided, I think, I'm going to have all the food that the U.S. Olympic team eats in China for the whole time they're in China imported. So they're going to spend their time in China, which seems like a real tragedy to me. But anyway, this great land of great culinary culture, they're going to be eating, 3-week-old beef, but it'll be imported from the United States, and vegetables and fruits imported from Australia and the like. So it's kind of interesting how that image has changed. But what I'd like to talk about today, and my focus today, is not going to be so much on images or even on the high culinary tradition, although there is a great culinary tradition that does go all the way down to every household, certainly to the village level. But my focus today is going to be on the embedded meanings of food in a very local context, in a village context, and the way food is used in this village context to create meaning and to create relationships between people. So I thought, just for purposes of comparison, well, now why isn't this working now? Uh-oh. Technology problem. Okay. Oh, well. Now it's working? Okay, great. So just as a point of comparison, and I'm going to create a stark contrast that's over-exaggerated, but just for point of comparison. I thought I'd start out by saying a few things, or sort of just summarizing, what about the way we consume food in the United States? Because in many ways I see it as sort of the polar opposite of what I'm going to be talking about today in a village in China. Well, our modern consumption is called grazing by Sidney Mintz because it's often disembedded. And by disembedded, what we mean is it doesn't create meaning in a particular space at a particular time. When we eat fast food or Starbucks, as the most extreme examples, these are food items that are uniform over all spaces and time zones. And our eating in these places becomes a process of refueling. And it goes along with what the sociologist Anthony Giddens called, sort of said about modernity, that it's sort of empty time. With Christmas and Thanksgiving or Passover or whatever notwithstanding, most of our time is not marked by specific customs in specific places. It's disembedded. So just as a sort of, to set this up as a point of contrast, I sort of thought, well, how do we consume food in the United States? Uh-oh, what happened? It's gone. Here we go. Okay, so food ingestion is frequently non-interactive and non-social. We just, take it in. We do several things at once. I like this. We consume, we eat, like here. We have popcorn plus a movie, a dinner plus television, or, lunch plus lecture, which would be like a horrible thing in rural China. If you're eating, that's enough. You don't need a lecture at the same time. We try to get maximum enjoyment in minimum time. So same idea, coffee while driving, eating while working. We do that all the time. We consume frequently during the day, and that's that principle of grazing. Okay, so now, what I'm going to talk about today, and this is a sort of this is an overview of what I'll talk about for the rest of the lecture, is I'm going to sort of talk about the way our foodways in rural China in some ways are on the opposite side of this spectrum. And again, I'm creating a little bit too much of a dichotomous of a model here. But foodways in rural China constitute what I would call a total social experience. Food is not just about intake, but it's a way that you create relations with the social body, people around you, with the physical body, with your own body, with the cosmos, your ancestors. And it's a way that you express many different kinds of meanings. For most rural people, A lot of the food they eat is the food that they grow or raise themselves. Some of it is commodified, things they buy on the market, and some of it is still wild. It's certainly not standardized, but it has a lot to do with creating particular meanings in particular spaces. So it's cultivated wild and a commodity. It's a way of relating to people and the cosmos. It marks particular times. It also expresses ethnic identity, and I'll talk about that as well. Almost every county in China has its own cuisine. It's a way to understand bodies and health. And it's a form of memory, embodied memory, and I'll hopefully get to that as well. And finally, food, because it plays such a very prominent role in people's lives, it's very frequently used as a metaphor to talk about other things in life. And I can't emphasize that enough. Food is really so dominant for people in the way they think about things. So I'm going to try to flesh out these points today, and it's really, I'm giving you sort of an overview. Any one of these things I could spend a lot of time on, but just to give you a sort of general sense of the way, the role that food plays. So where was I? Well, I was in Guangdong province, which is in southeast China. The village where I did my field work is in the northeast corner of Guangdong province. In this area, Meizhou, that I have underlined in red there. It's, or sometimes called Meixian. It's the home of the Hakka people. The Hakka are a subcategory of, in China there are many, many different languages, many people who consider themselves Han but have different languages. And the Hakka came down to Guangdong province about 500 years ago, and they call themselves the guest people simply because the Cantonese, who were there earlier, fashioned a way of referring to the Hakka. Hakka in Cantonese means guest people. So they're the guest people, although they've been there for hundreds of years. And I think we need to keep in mind that in China, there are many, many, you can go from, county to county, province to province. And of course, now with education, everyone, or most younger people know Mandarin, but everyone has a local language or a local dialect, and that's the Hakka. Now, the village where I've been affiliated with this village since around 1993. I first went in the summer of 93. I had some friends from my prior field work in the diaspora whose parents were from this village. And then I went back in 95 to 96, summer of 97, and then I was back there this spring. And Moon Shadow Pond is a fictitious name. We use pseudonyms in anthropology. There are about 800 residents, and 67% of the residents still farm. So most people still provide most of their food for themselves. However, only 6% of the residents only farm. That is, most people, farming is mainly the work of middle-aged women. And usually other people in the family, men or mainly younger people, are off earning cash somewhere. The village is very close to the county capital, which is a city of 300,000, which is very tiny by Chinese standards. 24% of the households have at least one member of the household who's migrated to one of the larger metropolises of Guangdong, many of whom work in factories producing the things which we buy in Ben Franklin. So here's just to give you a sense of the village. This is a photo from 1996. And actually the kids in the village, well, I know what's happened to them. They're now in their early 20s, and they're off working in various cities. And that's an interesting side story. But this is the symbolic center of the village. It's the ancestral hall. And in southeast China, lineage organization is very strong. So everybody can trace their ancestry back to a founding ancestor. The founding ancestor of this village was born in 1083. He was born in another province, and then they can trace when he came to Moonshadow Pond and founded it. And then over time, this founding ancestor established various lineage branches. And so everyone in the village knows I'm a member of, this lineage, branch 2, and branch 5 of branch 2. And so everyone knows sort of who they are and how they're related to the founding member of the village. So inside of every ancestral temple in Southeast China, you'll find an ancestral altar with the names written of all the male ancestors, it's patrilineal, going back to their founding ancestors. So just to give you a sense, this is the sort of symbolic center of the village. And it is important when we get to New Year's time and all kinds of food offerings made to those ancestors still. So I'd like to just first quickly paint the food universe. Where does food come from? Rice is still the staple. Land in rural China is still not alienable, and what that means is even though China has gone from being sort of a communist country to a neoliberal, capitalist paradise, if that's what you think is paradise, in fact, land is still owned by the collective, and each family in a village has use rights in the land. They can't sell it. And this was actually a very brilliant thing, which they did in China, because it means that if times get bad and the economy goes down, the people working in the cities can go back to their homes and they'll still have a piece of land and, they'll have food to eat. So every family still has land, and rice is still the staple, mainly, as I said, as you can see, grown by middle-aged women. Gardening, also, this goes way back. This goes back to the collective era, except in the late 50s, but even through most of the most collective of times, every family still had plots, private plots, on which they grew their vegetables. And after China went through its latest phase, everyone still has those private plots. And most people still garden for themselves. Again, most of the gardening is middle-aged women. But people like the fact that they sustain themselves. A, it's cheaper. But B, because of some of these food scandals, they take a lot of pride in the fact that their own food is fresh and, it's the ultimate of local food, although I don't think they would use that term. There have been some changes in the diet over the years. People are more prosperous. They grow different kinds of vegetables that require more oil to cook. And that's kind of interesting, what has changed and what hasn't. So you might see, there's cabbages there. And we don't think of cabbage as something expensive, but that kind of cabbage is a fairly recent invention, because if you want to stir fry it properly, you need a lot of oil. So things have changed over time, but there's still, most people provision themselves. They eat their own rice, they grow their own vegetables. Despite modernity and people being more prosperous, there are also traditional practices of preserving food that have pretty much gone on and continue to go on. One is these dried vegetables that you see. You can hang them, you can put them on your roof. You dry them in the sun, and then you put them in salt water. You can keep them in a brine, or you can completely dry them. And during what they call the Old Society, which was the pre-communist time, but even now, the standard breakfast is still rice, congee, or gruel, porridge made from rice, and to give it taste, you add salted vegetables. And that's, pretty much breakfast. And then wine is made from what we call sticky rice, but it's a different kind of rice, not the rice we would eat, but it's a different kind of rice. And people make wine from that, and this is in my landlady's house where she's making that sweet wine, and that's also used to make certain festival dishes, also used for women when they give birth. It's considered very heating, so they make a dish with lots of ginger and the sweet wine and chicken. And when, even in sort of poverty-stricken days, a woman who gave birth would have this dish with a whole sort of whole chicken in there every day for a month after she gave birth. So it's considered good for breast milk, and that's still done. Raising livestock and fish. This is something that was always there, but is much more there again with more prosperous times. So a lot of people, one thing that middle-aged men do to add cash to the family budget is raise pigs and raise fish. And then also it means anyone who's eating pork or eating fish in the village, it's fresh. When my landlady would buy pork from the butcher, in the morning at 6 a.m., the pig was alive at 3 a.m., and we would eat it at 6:30 a.m. Fruit, pomelo is, have any of you ever seen that? It's like in the co-op, it's like a grapefruit. So that's their big, since 1980, it's one of their big cash crops, and a lot of people raise pomelos for cash, but a lot of people have 8, 9, 10 pomelo trees of their own, and it stays for 3-4 months, doesn't go bad, and after dinner or after lunch, people will whip out a pomelo and share it with everybody else, and that's loading. Actually, there's a descendant of Marco Polo there. I don't know how we got there, but that's another issue. Goat milk, something new. So into this sort of traditional bunch of things. Everything I've talked about so far is something that would be, pretty much a traditional part of the diet. Milk is not part of the Chinese diet. Calcium comes from eating tons and tons of greens. You eat greens for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But now people are raising goats, and this couple raises goats and gives, milks the goats and brings milk to the customers every morning. Mainly old people and for infants. So and then one more aspect of the food universe, what we call value-added food businesses. This woman makes tofu every afternoon from the soybeans, makes the tofu, takes about 4 hours, goes out on her bike, sells the tofu, and then, it's another way to get cash, and everybody gets fresh tofu. So that's pretty much the food universe. Oh, one more thing. Yeah, get there. Foraging. This kind of surprised me that in this, cultivated world with some commodities, people still make incredible use of the wild world. Everything on the ground, every kind of weed, people will say, oh, that cures sore throat, and this is that, and this is that. There's nothing that people don't use. So for instance, there's a festival called the Qingming Festival, which those of you who know about Chinese society know is a time that you go to visit your ancestors' graves a couple of months after the New Year's. And Qing means bright and clear, but it also means green. So there are what they look like, 3 weeds that are used. One of them is here. It's just a weed growing on the side of the path. And those 3 weeds are chopped up and steamed and mixed with sticky rice flour, and they make qingming buns, which are these, the green buns, that are sort of a sweet steamed bun. And there's a gazillion examples like that. I would just go around writing all these things that were just collected. So there's still a lot of knowledge about that. And then some of those wild things is kind of a reverse course, or reverse process, have now been commodified. So for instance, this woman in the picture here, these are different kinds of tree barks and branches, and they're dried and put into soup, and each soup cures a different ailment. One might be for your kidney, one might be for your liver, one might be for your eyesight. And now that's traditional, but now those are sold at great value in the marketplace. The bottom are some snakes. They're just in the rice paddy. I just took a picture of them wallowing in the rice paddy. And those are traditionally just a wild thing you got, cut them up and stir-fried them with tofu. And it's actually may not sound like what we have here for lunch, but it's very tasty. But now that's also sold for a lot of money and made as a kind of a gourmet dish. So there's kind of an inversion process where some of the things that used to be sort of wild and commodified have now become things of great value. Okay, that's the food universe. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how food connects people to each other and to the cosmos. First of all, popular Chinese religion, it's gods, ghosts, and ancestors. You live this life, you have your connection to your parents, and when they die, you still have a connection to them and everybody who came before you. Those are the ancestors. You make sure you don't forget them, so you have to give offerings to them. And as your parents fed you when you were a child, and then they become old, and you feed them, and then they die, and you still feed them at certain times. So this is during New Year's time. Most of these shots are, actually the top two are in the ancestral temple, and there's a story, which I can't get into, behind every single offering and what it's for. At the bottom left, my landlady making offerings to the stove god and to the wealth god, the right. He comes at midnight, New Year's Eve, so you want to have, and he's vegetarian. And I'll get into that. Close and remote ancestors. This is a group of villagers who've gone up, you sort of bury in the hills around the village, and up on the top hill here is an ancestor of the most important lineage branch in the village, and he was born at the end of the Ming Dynasty, so it's quite a while ago, but we haven't forgotten him. So once a year, people go and give food offerings. So one way to think of this is food is a means of connecting. And as I mentioned, I can't get into the details, but certain deities are veg and some are non-veg. And you should know which deities are which. Guanyin on the right there, because she's Buddhist, is a vegetarian deity. So you wouldn't give her meat. Of course, banqueting is famous in China. Banqueting is for every kind of occasion. It can be after you visit the grave of an ancestor. It can be because of your 81st birthday. It can be because you just adopted a child. It can be because of a wedding. It can be because of a funeral. It can be because you're opening up a new business. Banqueting is just ubiquitous, and it's the way you create connections. These particular photos, all but one, they're preparing a banquet after visiting the grave of the founder of a lineage branch. And then on the bottom right is just a very famous reason or common reason to banquet is what's called Huinyang or returning to your natal family over New Year's. Women on the second day of New Year's come back to their parents' home with their husbands, and in this home there were 7 daughters, so it was a big banquet. And there were probably about 10 tables. And that's, pretty common. Cooking knowledge is really very prevalent, and when people go out when people go out to travel, they say to waniwan, sort of to play. That's how people think of going on a road trip. It's, a time to enjoy yourself. And for rural people, may not have a chance to road trip to, Shanghai or Beijing, so they'll choose closer locations. And here, the Old Folks Association went off on a road trip to another village where one of their lineage branch founders' father there was a temple to him, so a lot of it is about lineages and family. But when you go, you don't take fast food and you don't take sandwiches or anything. You go with your bowls and your chopsticks and some ingredients, and you whip up a fast meal. In this case, fried rice with pork and dried mushroom, dried squid, and scallion, and then some soup. And this is common knowledge even with young kids. I went on a trip with a bunch of 6th graders, and I was the only adult. And we hiked to the top of a mountain, and we got to the top of a mountain, and then they pulled all these utensils out of their backpacks, and they stir-fried about 5 dishes. They were all no more than 12 years old. So it's just part of cultural knowledge. Tea is social grease. Banqueting is obviously a way of smoothing connections, but there are a lot of smaller ways. And, any of you who spent time in China realize tea is a fundamental, minimal form of social grease. the man on the right-hand side has a little store in the county capital. You don't just walk into the store. He'll offer you some tea. You know, the plastic cups are kind of a new and like maybe more lowbrow invention. But you would just go and he'd say, want some tea? And you'd sit and have tea and talk. And then, you know, he might say, do you want to buy something? But it's just very, it's the most minimal. If someone walks into your house and you don't offer them tea, you know, maybe there's something wrong there. So food is just a very common form of social exchange. And some kinds of social exchange may verge on what Americans see as, you know, corruption. So I wanted to get some data from the local government office. My landlady said, you know, you should bring some pears to the official. And so I thought I'd buy maybe 3 or 4 pears. You know, no. I bought a 20 kg box of pears. But the reason for that, pears were the seasonal fruit. I walk in. Well, and it's also relating to social exchange because that official can't just eat a pear. He has to give a pear to everybody else in the office. So, you know, I walk in with this 20 kg box of pears, paid for by my Middlebury travel grants. Anyway, then just to move on and say a few more things about symbolic meanings. You know, I said a lot at the beginning about how food here creates specific meanings in time and space. Every, you know, thing that you eat is for a particular time. And, you know, we do have remnants, again, here, you know, maybe making Christmas cookies or, you know, things like that. This is the backyard of the house where I lived, and my landlord and her mother-in-law and her granddaughter are making New Year's treats that will be deep fried, and some are savory, some are sweet, and then they keep. You don't need refrigeration. They keep for about 6 weeks, which is exactly correlating pretty much with the time of interfamily visiting over New Year's. In the rural areas, everything shuts down for 2 weeks. And so when people come, you know, you offer them these treats, or some of them, some of the sweeter ones, you can steam up and have them with breakfast. And so there's very specific. You never make them except at this time of year. And one thing, this is my only non-village picture, but it's very relevant because so many of the younger people in the village are living in the huge metropolitan cities in China. And then they all come back during New Year's, and they're rushing back. And, you know, part of what they're rushing back for is to get to that place, you know, that particular place where they have all these links. And that isn't so uniform and sort of, you know, not to say that they're not creating new meanings in the cities where they are. But this is taken this year, and it's the New Year's rush from Guangzhou. And all the young people, the vast, you know, 80% of the labor force is young people who are making all the stuff we buy, and they're rushing to get back. They want to get back home. And also, I should say, everything that's made, you know, has a particular meaning. It might be round, so it signifies family unity, or it might have a word in it that is a homonym for prosperity, etc. Okay, food as embodied meaning. Older people, younger people don't remember this. Older people remember starvation. And they can tell you a lot about what they used to eat. And there are things in the village that are now used for animal feed that people ate. And this is just an example. There are many others. But when you dry rice, then you have to husk it. And the husk that comes off, the outside of the husk, is really inedible. But this is what, let's say during the Great Leap Forward, the late 50s, during famine time, people would take that husk, mix it with water, and make a bun and steam it. And it, you know, it does a lot of damage to the stomach, but if you're hungry, that's what you eat. Now this stuff is fed, people feed it to their chickens. Similarly, there are many other things that were eaten before that are now animal feed. Some of the hunger foods, I should say, are actually good things, like sweet potatoes, which is actually very nutritious, but it's now thought of as a hunger food. Something sort of like a lima bean, which is really quite nutritious, but people don't eat it that much anymore because it's associated with a hunger food. They also have plants that make various kinds of things that are like cornstarch, and they would take that and mix it with boiled water so you would feel full, but it had no nutritional value. So another way that old people talk about their present condition, if you ask people, well, how's life now? The way people always reply is, well, we don't eat these things. We don't have to eat this stuff anymore. And that's how people describe their situation in terms of food. And so it's kind of embodied memory. I should also say that, the Chinese diet is famous or infamous for the fact that people have always made the most of everything. So you eat sweet potatoes, you stir fry the sweet potato leaves. You use garlic, the garlic bulb, you stir fry the garlic stem, which is really quite sweet and delicious. So there's always been that. But then beyond that, there were times when people really ate stuff that's they would not eat now. Conceptions of the body and health. Now, I think, we all have an idea that what we eat, has an impact on our health. And we share that with Chinese, but I think in rural China, it's much more specific than that. People will say, this is good for the small of your back. And this thing is good for your kidney. That's good for your liver. That's good for your brain. People have a very specific understanding. Also, every single food is categorized according to a humoral system. So foods can be hot, they can be warm, they can be cold, they can be cool, or they can be neutral. And depending on your own way that your own body works, then you have to figure out what particular, balance that you want. And this is kind of a general knowledge. Now, fast food is not unknown. The bottom picture is my landlord's grandson, and we went into town over New Year's, and he bought potato chips, which he's eating with delight. And those kinds of factory foods would be all considered heating. They're taken into the traditional Chinese way of seeing things, and they're seen as heating and actually seen as dangerous. So you don't want to have too much of them, or you get diarrhea or things like that. So people are pretty concerned about kids eating too much manufactured food because of what they think of as its impact on the body. I said ethnic identity. There's no such thing, obviously, in China as Chinese food. Every county, every town has its own cuisine. In Guangdong province alone, which is where I did my field work, we usually think about Cantonese food because so many Cantonese emigrated to the United States, over the course of the last century. But there are 4 important ethnic groups, and the Hakka are one of them. And the different groups characterize each other by their cuisine. So the Hakka will say, the Cantonese cuisine is too salt, and the Cantonese will say, the Hakka cuisine is too savory. And they'll both say, the Chaozhou cuisine doesn't fill you up. And, Beijing, don't go there, food is awful. So people basically characterize each other in terms of, literally what they eat. Now I want to end with a couple of things about sort of symbolic meanings of food. And as I said, this is a kind of fast-paced run through lots of different things. And any one of these, you could spend an hour talking about. But the first is this idea of food as metaphor. Because food is so central in Chinese culture and in this rural area, it has a lot of symbolic meanings. And one of the things people do, for instance, in those displays you saw where people were giving food to the ancestors or the gods, is everything's there for a reason. So anything that has a fa sound might be placed there because fa means to prosper. Or anything that has a ping sound, like apples, but ping is also a homonym for peace. So that would mean family peace. Anything that has a gao, gao means upward, to move up, and so certain kinds of biscuits are called gao, so you'd put those biscuits there to try to create upward movement in your life. And I've given a couple of other examples of homonyms. Oranges also in Hakka, homonym for auspicious. Fish are a homonym for plenty. So there's lots of plays on words. And here, just as an example, on the top left-hand corner, the steamed red buns, those are made out of sticky rice, and they make a flour out of the sticky rice, and then actually they color it red, and it's called a hua ban in Mandarin, but in Hakka it's fa, which again means to prosper, and so and red is auspicious. So you would use those for any kind of event where you want to bring on, good luck and prosperity. This is my landlord's daughter and son-in-law. They are opening a new store, so they've put the red buns, fish, chicken, and pork, which are each in various ways homonyms for good luck and prosperity. And they have a bunch of other things, each of which I could explain if I had time, that they put out on the table sort of to bring the good luck in. Now, finally, food is ultimately a metaphor for social relations, how you act with other people and interrelate to other people, and yourself as a moral person is often understood with food metaphors. And I've given a couple of examples here. If you know someone really well and you can talk about your relationship with them as ripe. If the whole reciprocal responsibility of parents take care of kids, kids take care of parents, we all take care of ancestors, we're inextricably, tied in through our mutual reciprocity, is understood by this idea of yang, and the idea of that is really understood as sort of mutual feeding, really. The collective era and political eras are also often understood in terms of food metaphors, and these you may be familiar with. The collective era often is referred to with these food terms: the iron rice bowl, eating the state's rice, eating the collective's rice. These are all ways of referring to the more strictly communist era. And finally, our interrelations with other people. China being a society where your obligations to others never ends. Okay, once somebody does something for you, you're bound to them, then they're bound to you, and it just doesn't end even when you die, as you've seen. So the moral person is the person who remembers their obligations to others, and the amoral or immoral person is one who doesn't remember their obligations. And those understandings of morality are also often couched in terms of food metaphors. So I've just given two here, but there are many, many more. One, when you drink water, remember the source. So, who gave you that? You were thirsty, you got water, remember who gave it to you. It's a very common metaphor for talking about the importance of mutual obligation. And then the fact is not everyone is a moral person, not everyone does remember their obligations, so when a person leaves, the tea becomes cold, is a way of talking about people who do forget. They leave the area, maybe like the visiting anthropologist, and they forget. So anyway, my last day this spring, just so I wouldn't forget, I participated in two kinds of goodbye food events. One was held by the Old People's Association, and it was a fairly simple food event where we had tea, oranges, peanuts, which is also a traditional crop there, and biscuits. And the other was my students, who are the same age as my students here, really. They were in the 4th grade in '96. And now they're young adults in 2007. Some of them have gone off to various cities and have just returned to visit their parents from time to time. Some have gotten work in the area. And one was coming back from Guangzhou, where she was working, and she heard I was leaving, so she had her mother and father prepare this great banquet for me the night before I left. And pretty much everything in the banquet was something they grew, or raised. Fish, chicken, all kinds of vegetables. It was a fabulous banquet. So anyway, they were also participating and, hoping the tea doesn't become cold, right? And I don't just forget about them. So that's 45 minutes on the dot. So I will stop right here and then take questions for a few minutes. Yes, David.
We hear about China's capitalist boom leaving behind a lot of the rural population. Are these folks that you're with close enough to the factory zones that in effect they're subsidizing their rural way of life now with urban wages?
Yeah, you have to subsidize. Well, as I said, only 6% of the people here are only farming. Now, some of the people are subsidizing their subsistence farming with businesses like raising pigs or raising fish. But they're close enough either to the county capital or more likely, in most of the cases, they're young people in the family who have gone off to Shenzhen or Guangzhou or one of the bigger cities who are sending some money home. And another thing that's kind of interesting is, what is your home? And your home is defined as where you return to eat over New Year's. So when they do the census, there's this whole issue of the floating population, because a lot of the young people, like in this last photo, they're not resident full-time in the village anymore, but they're counted as being in the village because they eat, that's where they eat over New Year's. But yeah, I would say without wages, it'd be harder, much harder. On the other hand, they wouldn't be landless. And so, I am not by any means endorsing every policy undertaken by the Chinese government, but this was a brilliant move because so long as they can protect their land rights, if these kids lose their jobs because there's a factory in Vietnam that can make something cheaper, they can go home. They won't be rich, but they'll have rice and vegetables and, pork. Yes?
Do the kids that go out into the factories and things, do they send all their money home, or how does their...
No, well, some, they need some to sustain themselves wherever they are. They also need money for marriage, so a lot of them save money for that. What usually happens is, see the hefty young man on the right there. He was a student in my 4th grade class in '96. He's now working. While I was in the village, I saw a 2nd floor going up on his parents' home. And I said, well, he's about to get married. And he did. And unfortunately, I missed the wedding, which was a shame because it was about 3 days after I left. But so a lot of money is saved, especially, but both sides. The groom side pays, but the bride side wants her to come into the marriage with things and with cash. Yeah, Mike.
I'm trying to figure out this business about leaving, going to the city, and then coming back when you are out of a job. The land presumably doesn't lie fallow while you're gone.
No, your parents work it.
Somebody's working it.
Yeah.
And you come back and effectively displace somebody.
No, well, okay.
How does that work?
Okay, well, let me explain. I think there's a crisis looming because, as you notice, I said the people doing the agricultural work are middle-aged women. You come back to your parents' land. So, but, it's your family's land, or they have use rights in it. Hopefully, China is hoping, obviously, that not too many people are going to come back. But not everyone can leave either, or who's going to do the farming? So they're in a little bit of a quandary now because they've pulled all these people into the cities, the floating population. Nobody wants to be a farmer, but China doesn't want to import all its food. So, but if you went back, and also Chinese labor is getting more picky. There are wildcat strikes all the time now that are not reported. And a lot of people will not work for less than a certain amount. And I've seen people go back to their lands and say, I'm going to sit here till I get a better job. I'm not going to starve. Why should I go to Shenzhen for 1,000 yuan a month, and then I have to pay for my food there and pay for my rent, when I can go home and laze around home, and my mom will feed me. But it's actually meant that labor, and you might have read some of this, it's far too dictatorial a political system to allow for free labor unions. But there's a lot of stuff happening through the pressure. And part of that is knowing you do have land to go back to gives you a little bit more say. Charlie?
With a lot of the younger generation migrating into cities and urban populations booming in China right now, the rural population has been like struggling to keep up by feeding them. And I'm aware that there's been a huge increase in the amount of agricultural chemicals and fertilizers being used.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you saw any of that in this town and how that is changing people's relationship with
Right.
the food that
Okay.
they're eating.
That was bifurcated in an interesting way. You saw the vegetables. That's for consumption for yourself. And people are, there's kind of, I think in China, if there could be, there's an indigenous, green idea. Because people were very careful to say to the vegetables they were going to eat for themselves, not to put anything on it. Because they said, that's why we don't, aside from the fact that there was this labor force that could grow this stuff. Most people said, we don't like to buy food. We like our own food because we know what's on it. And the stuff you buy in the marketplace, that's a commodity, we're suspicious of it. We don't want to eat it. The only food people ate themselves where that kind of natural thing didn't apply has to do with rice. And that's because the government has really pushed hard, the nitrogen-based fertilizer and stuff like that, which has huge yields. And the problem now is, if you're a 50-year-old female and you're going to grow rice for the family for a year, without the government coming in and supporting you to change over, the nitrogen-based fertilizer field is going to produce a lot more rice, and then you're set for the year. So rice is the only thing that people themselves eat that they apply things to, and that's going to have to take. It's going to have to take a lot to turn that around because the yields have shot up and the agricultural population is going down. So, the easiest solution is use this stuff and fewer people need to cultivate more rice. But it's interesting that what people themselves ate, other than that, they were very wary of the marketplace. Yeah.
So I'm also aware, aside from these chemicals going into the food itself as it's grown, there's a lot of excess chemicals that make it into the water, and
it's a mess.
Yeah. Did you notice that? And is it causing consternation?
Yes.
In the local
the
population?
environment is that's another.
Just especially with how it relates to food production.
Oh yeah. Well, I think it's. First of all, the pollution is humongous because just even little things like the little plastic bags people use for everything, and they just get thrown all over the countryside. But people are aware. I mean, they'll say things like, "We could drink the water from the local river 10 years ago, and we wouldn't dare drink it now." What's lacking, of course, is a means to change that because you don't have a democratic society where, let's say, an environmental movement could emerge. On the other hand, things happen from the top in China, and they're sort of aware of it too. I mean, if everyone keels over from poison, which could happen, I mean, it's bad. But the food thing is interesting because it's a kind of a local response to that, and that's one reason people are so tied to provisioning themselves because they can be sure of that. Yeah.
Is there enough ethnic
intermarriage, that there are competing food traditions, and if there are, how are they resolved in communities?
Yeah. Well, the competing food traditions get commodified in the city as things that you sell. So, like a lot of the young men in this village go to the cities and they become Hakka cooks, which is better than becoming, a worker in a, let's say, sneaker factory, right? You can gain a little more, you can earn a little more that way. So there's some, with migration to the cities, the next generation, there's more intermarriage, and I kind of charted that, and I looked at marriages, and it's like a huge increase. I think a quarter of the marriages in this village contracted since '96 were with non-Hakka. And prior to that, it was tiny. So that might be, ways that different food traditions might come in. But the food traditions are also commodified, and it's a form of income, too. Yes, Judy?
What effect is the one-child policy having on people's ties to their local places and tracing their ancestry?
Right. Well, firstly, it wasn't exactly a one-child policy in this province. Until 2000, it was a two-child policy for all rural dwellers. Now, because it's called One National Policy Provincial Implementation, National Policy Provincial Implementation. In 2000, they changed it and said, if your first child is a girl, you can have a second one. But if it's a boy, you can't, because the idea being the girl will marry out, and how will we have Social Security? Because China cannot provide Social Security for rural dwellers. So now it's a 1.5 child policy. But there have also been some changes. For instance, some of the ancestral temples are beginning to add women's names, so that one of the ways you can deal with fewer descendants is you start incorporating women, which is a big change into the descent line. And so I don't know. I think it's not really affecting people's ties. The big thing I see is, the unanswerable question of what happens to all this land in 20 years. Because none of these young people wants to farm. And so that's going to depend a lot on economic circumstances, I think, on, the political economy. Yes?
How about storage and preservation of food?
Yeah, storage and preservation? Well, yeah. These traditional methods that are still used were, traditional ways of preserving, fermenting, drying. Those New Year's sweets, as I said, would last for six weeks. New Year's treats will last for 6 weeks. So, the traditional mechanisms or traditional means for, of preservation. People have started to get fridges, but people don't really like them because they think once you put something in the fridge, you've ruined it. So, and why would you put meat in the fridge if you walk across the street and, your next door neighbor butchered a pig at 3 a.m? So, you buy that pig, or, if you want a chicken, you can get a fresh chicken. And I would say, even in cosmopolitan places like Hong Kong, where people obviously, have fridges, but there's a lot of emphasis. This is where the local tradition and the high culinary tradition meet, right? People don't like the idea of eating old stuff. They think it's bad for you and tasteless, and yeah.
We have had to preserve things here. My wife's from an old family in Vermont, and they just didn't have refrigeration, canned everything. It's because we wind up with 6 months of winter. So, but I imagine in those pictures you showed us, I didn't get a sense of I don't know what the seasonal, what is the growing season?
Oh, okay, yeah. This is Southeast China, kind of like Georgia. It's actually very cold. It goes down to 1 degree centigrade, and there's no heat. So we usually had about 5 layers on, when we were inside the house, because you cannot escape the cold. But it never goes below. So it'd be like 1 degree centigrade would be like our, 33, 34. That's about the coldest it gets. They have 2 Therefore, it's what we would call semi-tropical. It's not tropical. They have 2 rice crops a year. Things like cauliflower and cabbage grow pretty much throughout the winter. They always have greens. Traditionally, the sweet potato, which was brought 300 years ago from the New World, came to this part of China and is credited with the population boom, the first population boom in China, because there are these 2 rice crops, but people would start running out of rice as they got into the winter. Then the sweet potato got introduced from North America in the 17th century, and it became the sustaining food for the winter months, along with peanuts. And that's why the sweet potato is often mentioned. If you talk to an old woman and say, what did life used to be like in the 1930s? Say, all we ate was sweet potato. It has a kind of bad connotation. Although now it's kind of become sort of yuppified and it's, being reinvented. So that's basically, it's semi-tropical. It doesn't feel like that. When you're inside and it's 33 degrees, you're freezing, but nothing ever actually freezes.
We're actually, unfortunately,
Yes.
out of time, but thank you, Ellen, for a wonderful
You're welcome.
presentation.